They called it exploration, but the ice always knew it wasn't discovery. It was surveillance. And now, the oldest seal on Earth begins to crack. Close your eyes. Picture the moment when faith met the forbidden. There was a time when men sailed not merely by stars, but by the word carved into their hearts. James Cook, whose fingers traced scriptures as much as charts, knew the sea had boundaries, not the boundaries of men, but the decrees of the Creator who said, "Thus far you shall come and no farther." In the 18th century, when the world still breathed mystery, Cook departed with HMS Endeavour. His nautical charts contained more than coordinates. They contained verses. Job 38 was marked in their margins. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? With each mile sailed, Cook understood he wasn't discovering, but unveiling what had already been established since the foundation of the world. The captain read maritime currents like one reads prophecies. He knew waters find their level because it was so ordained, not by physical laws invented by men, but by the eternal decree that established barriers to the proud sea. His 3 voyages around the Antarctic Circle weren't failures. They were revelations. With each frustrated attempt to find a land beyond the ice, Cook understood a greater truth. There are seals that must not be broken by human hands. Decades later, James Clark Ross would follow Cook's trace routes, but with different hunger. Ross didn't merely sail, he mapped between 1839 and 1843. His expedition would become legend not for what he found, but for what he defined. The Ross Sea, the Ross Ice Shelf, the volcanoes Erebus and Terror. Names that fix themselves on maps like marks of possession over something that should never have been possessed. Ross saw the ice wall extend infinitely, a crystalline barrier that reflected not just sunlight, but the glory of the firmament. His men whispered that the ice sang at night, sounds like distant choirs, as if the frozen waters still remember the days of creation, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Feel the weight of witnessing something beyond human comprehension. But it was upon returning that Ross understood the magnitude of what he had witnessed. Antarctica wasn't discovery, it was a warning. The continent appeared on published maps as if the world had shrunk, as if humanity had conquered another secret. Yet in Ross's eyes was the weight of one who had seen beyond the veil and knew some doors should not be opened. The nautical charts he produced were more than geographies. They were documents of containment. Each line drawn was an attempt to delimit the unlimited, to map the infinite. Ross had touched the edge of the terrestrial seal and, upon returning, carried on his shoulders the burden of one who knows what lies beyond the known waters. In the silence of polar nights, when the aurora borealis danced overhead like divine glory refracting through the crystalline firmament, Ross heard the echo of Job's words, who shut up the sea with doors when it burst forth from the womb. And then he knew Antarctica wasn't the end of the world, it was its guardian. The ice remembers what men choose to forget, but not all navigators would come with faith. Some would bring iron machines and metal wings, determined to fly where angels fear to tread. Close your eyes. Picture the moment when faith met the forbidden. There was a time when men sailed not merely by stars, but by the word carved into their hearts. James Cook, whose fingers traced scriptures as much as charts, knew the sea had boundaries, not the boundaries of men, but the decrees of the Creator who said, "Thus far you shall come and no farther." In the 18th century, when the world still breathed mystery, Cook departed with HMS Endeavour. His nautical charts contained more than coordinates. They contained verses. Job 38 was marked in their margins. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? With each mile sailed, Cook understood he wasn't discovering, but unveiling what had already been established since the foundation of the world. The captain read maritime currents like one reads prophecies. He knew waters find their level because it was so ordained, not by physical laws invented by men, but by the eternal decree that established barriers to the proud sea. His 3 voyages around the Antarctic Circle weren't failures. They were revelations. With each frustrated attempt to find a land beyond the ice, Cook understood a greater truth. There are seals that must not be broken by human hands. Decades later, James Clark Ross would follow Cook's trace routes, but with a different hunger. Ross didn't merely sail, he mapped between 1839 and 1843. His expedition would become legend not for what he found, but for what he defined. The Ross Sea, the Ross Ice Shelf, the volcanoes Erebus and Terror. Names that fix themselves on maps like marks of possession over something that should never have been possessed. Ross saw the ice wall extend infinitely, a crystalline barrier that reflected not just sunlight, but the glory of the firmament. His men whispered that the ice sang at night. Sounds like distant choirs, as if the frozen waters still remember the days of creation, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Feel the weight of witnessing something beyond human comprehension. But it was upon returning that Ross understood the magnitude of what he'd witnessed. Antarctica wasn't a discovery, it was a warning. The continent appeared on published maps as if the world had shrunk, as if humanity had conquered another secret. Yet in Ross's eyes was the weight of one who had seen beyond the veil and knew some doors should not be opened. The nautical charts he produced were more than geographies. They were documents of containment. Each line drawn was an attempt to delimit the unlimited, to map the infinite. Ross had touched the edge of the terrestrial seal and, upon returning, carried on his shoulders the burden of one who knows what lies beyond the known waters. In the silence of polar nights, when the aurora borealis danced overhead like divine glory, refracting to the crystalline firmament, Ross heard the echo of Job's words, who shut up the sea with doors when it burst forth from the womb. And then he knew Antarctica wasn't the end of the world. It was its guardian. The ice remembers what men choose to forget, but not all navigators would come with faith. Some would bring iron machines and metal wings, determined to fly where angels fear to tread. Breathe deeply. What you're about to hear was never meant to leave the ice. In 1928, when Richard Evelyn Byrd lifted his forward trimmer over the frozen expanse, he didn't know he was crossing more than coordinates. He was transgressing thresholds. The Antarctic sky opened before him like an unrolled scroll, revealing characters written in ice and wind that few men were destined to read. Byrd was different from the navigators who came before, where Cook sought with humility and Ross mapped with reverence. Byrd flew with the arrogance of one who believed machines could conquer mysteries. His expeditions between 1928 and 1935 weren't merely scientific. They were challenges. Challenges to the unknown, the unexplored, the sealed. On the morning of November 29, 1929, when Byrd became the first man to fly over the South Pole, something changed. Not just in aviation history, but in the very structure of reality that humanity knew. For 19 hours, he soared over territories no map had recorded, landscapes that defied everything they knew about the frozen continent. It was during these flights that Byrd began to see inconsistencies, regions that should have been ice-covered revealed vegetation, mountain formations that appeared on no chart, and more disturbing still, structures that seemed artificial, ancient, as if lost civilizations had flourished in lands that science declared uninhabitable for millennia. But it was in the 1946-47 expedition, Operation High Jump, that truth revealed itself in all its terrible magnitude. With over 4,000 men, warships, and military aircraft, Byrd led the largest Antarctic expedition in history. Officially, it was scientific research. Unofficially, it was something far more sinister. Picture a fleet of war machines descending upon the most sacred seal on Earth. The naval force that accompanied Byrd wasn't for exploration, it was for containment, as if they knew something in the frozen continent needed to be watched, controlled, kept secret. Official reports spoke of mapping and geological studies. Secret reports, which never came to light, whispered discoveries that would challenge the very foundations of accepted cosmology. During a reconnaissance flight over the South Pole, Byrd witnessed something that would mark him for the rest of his life. Beyond the transantarctic mountains, where there should have been only eternal ice, green land stretched out. Not just green, but inhabited. Rivers flowed freely. Lush vegetation covered protected valleys. and on the horizon, structures that looked like ancient cities gleamed under a light that didn't come from the sun. It was then that Bird understood the true nature of Antarctica. It wasn't a continent. It was a seal, the greatest seal on Earth, covering not just frozen land, but abysses that connected to regions beyond human comprehension. The ice wasn't natural formation. It was divine containment. Upon returning from that expedition, Bird carried in his eyes the weight of forbidden truths. In his public interviews, he would speak of an area as large as the United States that has never been seen by a human being beyond the pole on the other side of the South Pole. But between the lines, those who had ears to hear understood. There was more land, much more hidden beyond the ice seals. Feel the burden of knowing what cannot be spoken. The change in Bird was visible. The confident aviator had become a haunted man. He had flown beyond the veil and seen what lies in the depths of the earth. Not just caves and geological formations, but passages. Passages that led to places that weren't on maps because they didn't belong to the surface realm. In the years that followed, Bird would become increasingly reserved about his Antarctic discoveries, as if he had signed pacts of silence not with governments, but with forces much older and more powerful. His last public testimony about Antarctica carried the tone of one who had seen beyond human limits and understood that some secrets are sealed for reasons that transcend scientific curiosity. Some doors open only when the time of seals expires. The explorer who once conquered the skies had touched something that conquered him in the white silence of the forbidden continent. Bird had glimpsed the architecture of reality itself, and discovered it was nothing like what humanity had been taught to believe. But Bird wasn't the only one to discover that the ice guarded secrets. Others, with far darker intentions, were already walking upon the sealed continent. What you're about to witness is humanity's greatest act of cosmic rebellion. In 1962, while the world still trembled with echoes of the Cold War, a secret operation was launched that few understood in its true magnitude. They called it Operation Fishbowl, a name that revealed more truth than the planners ever publicly admitted. From Johnston Atoll in the Pacific, missiles carrying nuclear warheads were fired not against earthly enemies, but against the sky itself. The official objective was to test the effect of high-altitude nuclear explosions on Earth's magnetosphere. The real objective was far more disturbing: to discover if the firmament could be shattered. The first detonation, codenamed Starfish Prime, produced results that shocked even the most skeptical scientists. The nuclear explosion at 400 kilometers altitude created an artificial aurora that could be seen from Hawaii to New Zealand. But more than that, it created cracks. Cracks in the very structure of the sky that persisted for months, releasing radiation in patterns that defied all known physics. Military observers watched through special telescopes, documenting something their reports would call anomalous electromagnetic disturbances. But technicians whispered among themselves about what they really saw: fissures in the crystalline firmament, as if the very ceiling of the world had been damaged by their arrogance. The bluegill test followed starfish, then kingfish. With each explosion, the anomalies intensified. Radio communications were interrupted not by technical interference, but by sounds, voices that seemed to come from beyond the torn veil. Some operators reported angelic choirs mixed with lamentations, as if the sky itself wept for the wounds opened. Listen, can you hear the firmament crying? Dr. James Van Allen, the physicist who gave his name to Earth's radiation belt, observed the data with growing horror. The explosions weren't just creating artificial radiation. They were creating holes. Holes that open and close like wounds trying to heal, revealing glimpses of something beyond human comprehension. It was during the Kingfish test that the most disturbing event occurred. The nuclear warhead didn't detonate at the planned altitude. Something prevented it. Instruments recorded an unknown force that literally held the explosion, containing it in a sphere of energy that pulsed with colors that didn't exist in the known visible spectrum. That night, ground observers reported visions that were immediately classified as ultra-secret. The firmament hadn't just cracked, it had opened. For several hours, through the fissures created by the explosions, it was possible to see beyond the crystalline veil. And what they saw wasn't the space vacuum that science promised, but waters, infinite waters extending beyond any horizon, illuminated by a light that came from no sun. The theologians, secretly consulted by the military, immediately recognized the descriptions. It was what the scriptures called the waters which are above the firmament, the sea of glass like crystal that is before the throne of the Most High. Operation Fishbowl hadn't tested weapons. It had violated the very celestial sanctuary. Feel the weight of witnessing the throne room of creation through broken glass. In the months that followed, strange phenomena began to be reported globally. Migratory animals lost their bearings, as if their internal compasses had been disrupted by the firmament's disturbance. Meteor showers increased dramatically, as if fragments were falling through the open cracks. And in various parts of the world, people with spiritual sensitivity reported identical dreams, visions of winged beings descending through openings in the sky. The most disturbing of all effects was discovered only decades later, when more advanced satellites could map the persistent anomalies. The explosions had created not just temporary damage, but permanent marks on the firmament, scars that can still be detected by sensitive instruments today, like eternal reminders of human arrogance in challenging the limits established by the Creator. Operation Fishbowl was officially terminated in 1962, but its effects continued for years. Each subsequent test encountered growing resistance, as if the sky itself had developed defenses against future violations. Projectiles disappeared inexplicably, equipment failed without technical reason, and the military personnel involved began reporting experiences that challenged their sanity. Understand this, the dome fights back. It was then that world governments understood a terrible truth. The firmament wasn't just a physical barrier, but a spiritual one. The scriptures that spoke of contained waters and solid heavens weren't poetic metaphors, but literal descriptions of a reality that modern science had rejected out of intellectual pride. The project was sealed under multiple layers of classification, not for national security, but for something much deeper, the understanding that they had touched forces that transcended all human understanding. And in the depths of military archives, a final report remains sealed to this day, containing a single line that summarized the operation's true conclusion. The ceiling is cracked, but still holds. Every crack in heaven's dome lets more light through. But while they try to break the celestial seal, they ignore that another seal, far more ancient, was beginning to yield in the frozen depths of the south. While they attempted to breach the celestial seal, they ignored that another seal, much more ancient, was beginning to yield in the frozen depths of the south. What happens when enemies become allies? When the thing they fear is greater than their hatred for each other? In 1959, an unprecedented event in human history took shape. Nations that mortally despised each other united in common purpose. The Antarctic Treaty wasn't about scientific cooperation, as they proclaimed to the world. It was about containment. Containment of secrets that, if revealed, would change not just maps, but the very nature of human faith. 56 nations signed a document that transformed the most mysterious continent on Earth into forbidden territory, officially to protect the environment and promote peaceful research, unofficially to ensure that what Byrd had seen and what others had discovered in secret expeditions remained buried under layers of ice and silence. The true negotiations of the treaty didn't happen in conference rooms, but in underground bunkers, where photographic evidence, films, and explorer testimonies were analyzed by committees that officially didn't exist. Each page of the agreement had been drafted not by diplomats, but by secret theologians who understood the cosmological implications of what was being sealed. The most revealing clause of the treaty wasn't in its public text, but in classified addendums that remained hidden for decades. It established that any discovery that challenged established scientific or religious paradigms would be immediately contained and reported to an international council of ontological oversight, euphemism for those who guarded humanity's deepest secrets. Picture the moment when truth becomes too dangerous for the world to know. Behind the negotiations moved figures who rarely appeared in official photographs. Vatican cardinals consulted secret archives dating back to the first Christian expeditions. Kabbalistic rabbis interpreted ancient texts about lands beyond the firmament. Esoteric leaders of secret societies recognized in the Antarctic discoveries the confirmation of prophecies they had guarded for centuries. What terrified them most weren't the geographical discoveries, but the theological implications. If there were lands beyond what maps showed, if the ice concealed passages to regions that appeared in no accepted cosmology, then the entire structure of human knowledge was built on foundations of sand. The German expeditions of the late 1930s had brought evidence that was immediately suppressed after the war. Photographs of structures that predated any known civilization, maps of tunnels extending thousands of kilometers under the ice, and most disturbing of all, records of contact with entities that had inhabited these depths for millennia during the secret meetings that preceded the treaty. A document known only as the Arctic Scroll circulated among negotiators. It contained translations of texts found in Antarctic ruins, written in languages that shouldn't exist on Earth. They spoke of guardians of the abyss and seals established before the first age of man. Feel the weight of words that predate human history. It was then that world leaders understood that Antarctica wasn't just a continent. It was a lid placed over something that shouldn't awaken. The ice wasn't natural formation, but divine containment, established to keep dormant what lies in the depths of the earth. The treaty established more than territorial restrictions. It established containment protocols. Any unauthorized expedition would be intercepted not just by military forces, but by special units trained in ontological anomaly neutralization. Independent explorers who approached the forbidden zones too closely simply disappeared, as if swallowed by the ice itself. The consultative meetings mentioned in the public treaty were, in reality, briefing sessions where dangerous discoveries were analyzed and neutralized. Every photograph showing geographical inconsistencies was confiscated. Every testimony describing anomalies was discredited. Every piece of evidence pointing to realities beyond accepted paradigms was buried deeper than the secrets under the Antarctic ice. But the most sinister aspect of the treaty was its indefinite duration. There was no expiration clause because those who drafted it knew that what was being contained had no expiration date. As long as the seals kept closed what lay below, the treaty would remain in force. If the seals broke, well, there were other protocols for that eventuality. In the years following the signing, attentive observers noticed strange patterns. Scientists who discovered too many anomalies were transferred to classified projects. Journalists investigating inconsistencies in official versions suffered accidents. Independent explorers planning unauthorized expeditions encountered insurmountable bureaucratic obstacles or disappeared completely. Understand this. Some truths are more dangerous than any weapon. The treaty had created not just a protected zone, but a zone of silence, a place where dangerous truths were kept frozen not just by ice, but by the collective will of nations that preferred safe ignorance to dangerous knowledge. And between the lines of the document, those with eyes to see could discern the agreement's true nature. It wasn't environmental protection. It was ontological protection. Protection of accepted reality against truths that could crumble not just governments, but the entire structure of belief that kept human civilization functioning. The United Nations emblem, with its continent surrounded by olive branches, gained new meaning. It wasn't a symbol of peace, but of containment. The continents weren't being embraced by peace. They were being contained by it. And Antarctica, represented as a white halo around the known lands, revealed its true nature. Earth's greatest seal. The Watchers watched the Watchers who watched the seal. But seals, no matter how powerful, weren't made to last forever. And in the heart of the Antarctic ice, something ancient was beginning to stir. But seals, no matter how powerful, weren't made to last forever. And in the heart of the Antarctic ice, something ancient was beginning to awaken. This is the moment everything changes. The moment the last seal breaks. In the winter of 1974, something that should never have happened. In the heart of the Weddell Sea, an opening appeared in the ice. not a simple crack or natural melting, but a perfectly circular hole, as if something had drilled to the frozen seal from below. Scientists called it the Wetopalinia, a technical euphemism for what they couldn't explain. For 3 consecutive years, the opening reappeared in exactly the same location, defying all known laws of sea ice formation. Its edges were geometrically precise, as if cut by instruments of impossible precision, and from the depths emerged not just water, but something more, a vapor that carried sounds. Those who managed to approach the anomaly reported experiences that were immediately classified. Whispers coming from the depths, songs that seemed to echo from bottomless abysses, and occasionally, lights that pulsed from within the opening, as if something in the depths was trying to communicate with the surface. In 1976, the opening disappeared as mysteriously as it had appeared. Official records declared the phenomenon concluded by undetermined natural causes. But in classified files, a different note was recorded. Primary seal restored. Continue indefinite monitoring. Decades passed in apparent silence. The Wetopalinia became a footnote in oceanographic studies, a scientific curiosity quickly forgotten by the public. But in government situation rooms, specialized satellites maintained constant vigil over the exact coordinates where the opening had appeared. In 2016, 40 years later, the alarm sounded again. The opening had returned, but this time it was different, larger, deeper, and now it wasn't alone. Smaller openings began appearing in radial pattern around the main anomaly, as if a complex system of passages was being activated after decades of dormancy. Picture the moment when the Earth itself begins to open like a flower of revelation. Satellite images revealed something that froze analysts' blood. The new opening didn't just show dark water. It showed structures. Structures rising from the depths like submerged towers, made of material that reflected light impossibly, creating geometric patterns that hurt the eyes of those who tried to study them too long. Dr. Sarah Henderson, the oceanographer who discovered the anomalies, was found 3 days after her last transmission, wandering through the research station in a catatonic state. Her last recorded words were, "They're not structures, they're steps that descend to the foundation of the Earth." The research submarine sent to investigate the anomaly never returned. Their last sonar signals captured echoes that seemed to form patterns that audio analysts recognized as similar to language, but at frequencies that shouldn't exist on Earth. When they tried to decode the patterns, computers presented a single recurring translation. The seal is broken. It was then that the oldest archives were opened, documents dating back to the first Christian expeditions, when Orthodox monks had been secretly sent to consecrate the waters of the world's end. Their reports, written in archaic Latin, spoke of apocalyptic visions, waters that opened to reveal the pit of the abyss mentioned by the seer Patmos. Feel the weight of prophecy becoming reality. The book of Revelation began to be reread not as future prophecy, but as a map. "And I saw a star fall from heaven unto the earth, and to him was given the key of the bottomless pit. And he opened the bottomless pit, and there arose a smoke out of the pit as the smoke of a great furnace." The Antarctic openings weren't geological phenomena. They were prophetic fulfillment. The ice that had sealed the passages to the depths for millennia was yielding, not due to climate change, but due to divine chronology. The times were being fulfilled, and the seals established since the foundation of the world were beginning to be removed. In secret laboratories around the globe, theologians worked alongside quantum physicists trying to understand the implications. If the Antarctic passages really led to the foundations of the Earth mentioned in Scripture, then the very structure of reality was being revealed. Not a spherical Earth floating in vacuum, but a solid foundation with levels of existence that transcended modern cosmology. The sounds emerging from the openings were finally decoded by computers specialized in xenolinguistics. They weren't terrestrial languages, but something much older, the language that Scripture called tongues of angels, spoken by beings who inhabited the regions beyond the firmament and below the foundations. Listen with your spirit. The angels are speaking. In the winter of 2023, The main opening reached a diameter of 50 kilometers. Infrared images showed warm currents emerging from the depths, carrying not just vapor, but particles that weren't in the periodic table. Material from the foundations of the Earth was being brought to the surface for the first time since creation. And then, in the last transmission before all communications with the region were cut off, a research team reported the most disturbing vision of all from the depths of the opening. Something was rising. It wasn't smoke or vapor, but forms that seemed to ascend through the abyssal waters, as if awakening from millennial sleep. The last satellite image before the area was completely interdicted showed the surface of the Weddell Sea transformed. Where once there had been only ice and water, now there was something else. A landscape that seemed to belong not to Earth, but to the regions beyond the firmament that Scripture described as the habitation of celestial beings. Witness the moment when heaven and earth began to merge. The oldest seal on Earth had broken, and what emerged from the depths wasn't just water or gases, but truth itself about the nature of reality, a truth that will forever transform human understanding of where we really live. In the final hours before total silence descended upon Antarctica, observers reported that the ice wasn't just melting, it was being removed, as if invisible hands were undoing a seal placed millennia ago, revealing not frozen land but passages. Passages that led not just to the center of the earth, but to the very foundations of creation. When the last seal breaks, the first heaven is revealed. The last intercepted signal before the total blackout was a transmission on an unknown frequency. When decoded, it revealed a message in archaic Hebrew. The sons of heaven awaken. The time of seals has come to an end. And while the world watched the ice break open, few realized that the true awakening wasn't coming from the depths, but from the heights. If this story echoed something inside you, maybe it was always yours to tell.